Hello everyone. So we're back with another podcast. This is Isha, and I'm here along with Arpita, Koyal, and Sankalp. We're going to be discussing two texts today. One is a documentary called 13th by Ava DuVernay, and the other one is actually two short essays by Audre Lorde. One is called The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, and the other one is about women responding to racism. This is just a short trigger warning for the contents of the podcast itself. We are going to be discussing about racism, homophobia, as well as violence and the historical erasure of narratives of the subaltern. And these themes can be sensitive and triggering for some listeners.
I will be talking about the documentary 13 and how the documentary itself uh, portrays ideas of racism and how it shows that the black population in the United States is treated as the second class, or they have been granted the second class status by the white population. So the documentary 13th sheds light on the idea of othering through racism. It is how they have been over the period of history or throughout history have been othered due to the color or the race they belong to. Uh, this has been the case over decades and has happened again and again, which has created generational trauma for the population which is colored or the blacks in specific. The documentary 13th gives us two questions to look at, and these two questions are very important when we look at the idea of othering in general as well. That how politics and the idea of othering are related to each other, and how media plays a very important part in othering. So politics and othering, how they are intertwined, and how, as displayed in the movie 13, it is that politics and racism are being intertwined in this case. So for example, for political reasons or for political narratives, how the black population is portrayed as the common enemy or as the enemy for the population to look at in order to capture those vote banks is very problematic, yet runs a separate discourse in the United States. This is very similar to what happens in India as well, wherein the caste politics or the identity politics is used as an idea of othering and to create a common enemy just to ensure a certain vote bank or run a political discourse. Secondly, the idea of media and how media plays a role in othering is also very important. So, media is a tool that is very often exploited in the public space in order to run a certain discourse, as politics is, as I've mentioned before. So in this particular case, the media portrays the black population as a common enemy for the society and tries to make it a target. The discourse run by the media is contributing to the historical narrative and the generational trauma, and is actually creating an alternate discourse to the actual reality, which is polluting the public space for these colored population. So the public-private distinction that we also have to talk about can also be put into context over here. So the private sphere for the colored population, or the population that is other, or the black population in this case in the documentary 13th, their private space is being hindered due to the acts that are being carried out in the public space. So herein the question lies that how do you make sure that the private space remains unhindered due to the acts that are being taken out in the public space? So for example, when these blacks or the colored population are being persecuted due to the laws or the rules that are being passed out by the government, they're also losing out on privileges of private space, for example student loans, reservations, job applications, all of that, because those persecutions are not letting them grant those privileges, which are questionable, which are not really based on actual justice or what we see as fair justice.
Now, this is where the idea of both the hero and the monster will always. This brings up the idea that both the hero and the monster always coexist, because the idea of the hero is to remove the monster, but we can't have one without the other, and this is very clearly represented in the 13 documentary, as we see multiple representations in the context of how Black Lives Matter. For example, Black people are portrayed as cannibalistic and animalistic, and politics is so commonly used to portray was so commonly used to portray Black people in by using a more suggestive language in political messaging to garner support from particular groups, which are obviously the radicals, the whites. And this is called dog whistle politics. Now, this is where the question of the xenos or alien invader frequently operates as a liminal experience for human beings as over or against others. A lot of Western myths and imperialist stories need to identify the other so we can understand how they are being colonial. This is where the representational paradigm comes back, because as any media presented in the realm of radicalism is taken in context, and any representation is still in, quote unquote, in the master's house. We constantly see throughout the documentary, the 13th, the government is constantly making laws that other the blacks. Now, for example, the Stand Your Ground law, where Zimmerman was not found guilty because he was protected by the law, even though he pursued a black kid with that meant no harm. The black kid's name is Trayvon Martin. And like this, there are so many more examples that are portrayed not only in the 13 documentary, but across multiple medias.
And adding on to what Koyal had said about the hero removing the monster, we had also talked in class about the idea of public spaces and how they facilitate the interaction between the state and the other. In this case, both the documentary as well as Lorde's text showcase how black and colored bodies are not only dehumanized in the public space through physical violence, lynchings, and shootings, but also become a spectacle for the nation, for people who belong to the status quo, as well as, I think, the deviant bodies as both a warning and a display of power.
Okay, so going back to the idea of erasure of the other from public spaces, academia itself becomes such a space where the other gets actively excluded from, and this usually happens by material realities like money. And Lorde talks about how they should cut fee for women of color, lower class women, and homosexuals, and all such subaltern people. And in the title of her essay itself, she talks about the master's tools can never dismantle the master's house. And she talks about how the social institutes, especially that of feminist academia, is dominated by white women, and which is precisely why she says the master's tool can't dismantle the master's house, because what happens is white women's feminist voices usually assimilates those of marginalized women and poor women and of people of different races and genders and all of that. And she also reasons with white women that it isn't black women's responsibility to educate them, but it's also their responsibility to educate themselves and create a space for other women to make their point. And Bell Hooks also makes a similar point in regards to feminism, which can be added here, and like the gender division of labor, where women are made to do all the dirty work in feminism, and here it's usually people of subaltern backgrounds who are made to do all the dirty work instead of actually creating spaces and education themselves. And these ideas also they also translate about caste in India, where lower caste people are often actively excluded from institutes of education, and this can be talked about especially in a few deaths that happened in recent years of activists like Rohit Vemula, whose scholarship was revoked and who couldn't pay for his education, and Anita S, who couldn't crack NEET because she couldn't afford to go for NEET coaching, and Deepa Mohanan, who went on a hunger strike after facing caste-based harassment from a professor and was denied access to other educational possibilities in her field.
Okay, so in many ways, DuVernay picks up where Lorde left off, and Lorde has been talking about creating a space for black academics and white academics to sit and systematically have a talk about racism, and which is exactly what is happening in DuVernay's documentary, where they're talking about racism and its ties to slavery, which is also what Lorde talks about in her essay, which she refers to in the title of the essay, Master's House Cannot Dismantle the Master's Tools, where master becomes the slave owner and the plantation owner ties to slavery. And in many ways, DuVernay's documentary can also be considered a form of important text as it bridges the gap that American education systems still have, which is a general lack of accountability and responsibility and a complete annihilation of history through whitewashing, which is continually still doing in many ways, right? And uh, especially like through the idea of like the book ban and everything that's happening, and most of the books that are also banned happen to be by black authors that talk about complicated issues of race, gender, and sexuality. Some of the books are like The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, and All Boys Aren't Blue and The Hate You Give, and they all like systematically challenge the concept of other and dominant narratives and dominant cultures, which is also exactly what DuVernay's documentary is doing. And she's also politicizing pop culture and the use of medias like cinema, art, and all of that to talk about like the continual history of racial discrimination in America. And this is also very reflective of like what has been happening in India in the past few days, especially like the removal of Mughal history and Muslim authors from Indian school textbooks. Again, is a continual form of othering and erasing the narrative of the other from dominant spaces. And also, of course, the fact that Adivasi histories and Dalit Bahujan histories were never included in textbooks in the first place.
Now, if the central political struggle when it comes to black representation is about whether to work within the system to dismantle it, or you have to destroy to rebuild, a good example of that same struggle is in Spike Lee's most famous work, Do the Right Thing, which is designed to challenge its audience. Lee does not seek love and audience adoration. He seeks acknowledgement of the two opposing schools of thought within the American civil rights movement, which is symbolized by its two greatest leaders. The central struggle of the film lies between the perceived chasm between Dr. Martin Luther King's civil and resilient power and Malcolm X's defensive and radical strength. The film establishes this dichotomy through dialogue, through symbolism, and various visual techniques, guiding the audience to one historically recurring question: can both sides be reconciled? What is the quote-unquote right thing to do? Can you work within the system? Can one work to represent black characters and political leaders in media without falling prey to or promoting othering narratives? Or must the movement aim to create an entirely separate form of representation for their community?
I think another important thing that we need to talk about is anger, and the way that Audre Lorde has written about anger and how it comes to be represented in popular media. Lorde writes about the rhetoric of anger and aggressiveness being attached to the voices of people of color as well as to their expressions of dissent, where black women are often called harsh, aggressive, and unpleasant, and their arguments are muted because of this. I think this is a trope that can be seen in the Netflix show called Dear White People, where the protagonist is a biracial woman who is often represented as angry and over-involved, and she is even called so by her white boyfriend at one point in the show. And it is a good example to see how Lorde's arguments, especially when one can see the creation of the black woman as an angry and intimidating other whose presence creates great discomfort to the white people around her. It is also important to see or keep in mind that this anger is a result of historical violence, systemic discrimination, and trauma, and yet its expression is often met with disapproval, and it is sidelined with the pretext of being intimidating, which according to Lorde again allows for the preservation of racial blindness and also allows privilege to go unquestioned and unchecked. This anger is also often weaponized against people of color, especially black people. DuVernay shows how young people like Trayvon Martin were killed for merely walking down the street because their presence was not only a cause of discomfort for a white man, but also because their historical experience led to their anger being weaponized against them. The idea of the angry black woman or the angry black person isn't just about stereotyping or social discrimination or othering, but also a weapon used to constantly oppress the colored body. I think when we're talking about the representation of marginalized bodies in popular media, there is another short film that can act as an example of how Lord's arguments can be seen functioning in a different context, which is an Indian context. The film is called Gilli Pucci, and it's part of a larger anthology of films released on Netflix. But yeah, apart from the problematic casting of upper caste actresses to play the role of a Dalit lesbian, the ending of the film particularly raises the question of how anger can come into play, wherein the character of Bharti can be seen as expressing her anger at the historical othering of Dalit and queer bodies by making her upper caste love interest Priya quit her job by encouraging her to become an at-home mother. While this can be read as a villainization of Dalit characters and the perpetuation of patriarchal norms, it can also be read in light of Lord's argument on the recognition of one's anger towards the system and towards the historical trauma of othering experienced by deviant bodies, and also as a subversion of the silent and passive trope that is often applied to Dalit women on screen.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Isha, for that point, and I think it's a good note to end on. I think we've discussed a various spectrum of issues that concern racial politics in the States, and we've also talked about how that gets represented and how it can be translated into some of the caste politics that happen in India. And it's really interesting to see how a textual form of resistance by Lorde and a visual form of resistance from DuVernay meet, and how one like piggybacks off of each other to create a narrative. Especially, it becomes interesting to see how there's so many ways of otherization that happens to subaltern people, often by like excluding them from social institutes, by villainizing them and their bodies in popular media, and by continually othering them from any form of like public spaces. So yeah, I think it's a good note to end on, and thank you everyone for listening. I hope you had as much fun listening to it as we had recording it. Thank you.